All right. Welcome to the Sumer Sports Draft Show Day 2. We were not expecting to have a Day 2 show, but we decided to have one previewing the night. You guys in Detroit, Tej Seth, Ben Brown, Sam Bruchhaus, you guys had a show earlier today. It was phenomenal. I've been listening along. My drive home, by the way, last night after the first round of the draft there was a traffic jam. They were doing construction in the middle of the night. So I had to sit there in a traffic jam. And luckily, I had my guys talking football after the first round with me, so it soothed me. How you guys doing?
Yeah, we're doing good. We're out here in Detroit in the Sumer Sports Draft House. We're getting ready to go to the official draft, do some more coverage. We've covered a lot, guys. I mean, we've covered fantasy. We've covered some of the biggest movers. What do y'all got to say?
I think the only thing that hasn't surprised me about the draft so far is that Eric ran into traffic in Atlanta. I think that was the biggest lock of the draft, other than Caleb Williams going number 1 overall.
It's honestly amazing that independent of whatever, if I left at 4 a.m, I'd run into traffic in Atlanta. But so is life. We're gonna have a brief show today because a few of us, you guys got to go to the draft. I got to do another thing at 6:15. And so let's talk about some key topics. And the first one actually just came out, a little bit of a report from, I believe, the NFL Network that talked about what the New England Patriots basically turned down in an effort to not have to move down and just simply take Drake May. And it looks like the New York Giants offered the 6th overall pick, next year's first rounder, and Minnesota offered 11-23, next year's first rounder, and some pick swaps for the opportunity to take Drake May. The New England Patriots, despite all their roster foibles and the like, decided to stay at 3, take Drake May, make a bet that he's good enough to overcome some of the roster deficiencies, but also that they can also build around him starting today and build that roster anew. Fellas, when you hear about those prices, what do you think?
Yeah, so I would say right away, it does seem like, obviously, I don't think the compensation was there for what the New England Patriots were looking for from a draft compensation standpoint. I did go on Matthew Coller's Purple Insider show, and we did kind of talk about at least what it would take for the Vikings to move up. And the opening for what I proposed, like a starting point for the Vikings to go up to number 3, was basically along the lines of the reports that we're hearing right now. So I did think that at some point the Vikings in particular would probably have had to introduce like an additional second round pick. I don't think a pick swap in particular was going to get this deal done. Obviously, going like 4th first would have been a pretty egregious overpay from the Vikings. But I think overall, like I get it from both sides, and I do think like there was probably a line in the sand, and neither the Giants or the Vikings were really willing to cross it, and that was very much what the Patriots probably needed in order to justify moving down at this point.
Yeah, my initial reaction was I didn't actually think that was either trade was that much, given kind of what the historical value of trading up into the top 5 is. And so it was interesting to me that it was notable. New England just stays there. This is a really good question from our friend Jake Grossman, who I know we've had experiences with, University of Michigan Law. He asked a great question. Is turning down a good offer to trade down like the Pats did is essentially the same thing as trading up for a player at that price? That's an interesting thing, because if we open this can of worms philosophically, Sam, we're going to have to get the data for all the trades that were ever turned down before we really actually get an idea of who's a good GM and who's not a good GM.
Right. It's interesting when you're collecting that data. Number one, you have to pick a source of evaluation, which typically would be, some type of WAR or WA or AV or something like that. And that already, constricts the way you can view it into some type of regress metric. Then you could also do contracts, which adds in a whole nother element of the market. But when you're looking at just trades, a lot of the times you end up in that Jimmy Johnson type purview where, there's stuff that we don't necessarily believe to be true unless there's quarterbacks involved and other things like that. And adding that extra type of philosophy, I think shows, us at Sumer Sports have talked a lot about how we have the scouting element and the people who have done it in real life and understand the trades coming in. And then we have the data element of what we can objectively look at. And this kind of shows one of the parts of a general manager's job that is truly kind of an on-the-fly evaluation, given that there's so much uncertainty into what you could get or what you may be turning down. And you kind of have to make a decision of what's your true valuation of the picks that you currently have versus, you know, who you think you could get. I mean, if they would have traded down with the Giants, maybe they end up with another one of those quarterbacks, but it seemed as if Atlanta Atlanta ended up picking quarterback. It seemed like they picked a quarterback because they thought that people were trying to trade up. And so that's just an idea of the uncertainty of you don't really know what's going on. There's a ton of things that a general manager has to consider at that moment.
Yeah, it's so interesting, right? Because in some ways, the trades that actually happen, so there's two ways, Tej, right? There's the efficient market hypothesis, which is basically saying like how the strike price is actually what the true value of everything is. But we do know that the value of those picks has been different, and no two players that have ever been traded. So that third pick has been traded for when it was Trey Lance, when it was Sam Darnold, and now when it's this theoretical Drake May. You know, the fact of the matter is like when we look at trade charts, we look at the history of what's happened. Of course, there's some selection, right? It's been always good enough for these teams who are, you know, per Cade Massey and everybody, like obviously overconfident in their evaluations historically, when they can actually like override their own evaluations. That means that the trade up has been advantageous, at least for the trade back team. And maybe that's what we're seeing historically in all of the data, is that these teams, when they trade back and give up on a generational player type guy, and that's not necessarily a label that Drake May has, but when they give up on a player of that caliber, it's got to be for something that shakes them off of that, not necessarily what is a fair market price for Drake May.
Right. I think you bring up such a good point there, where these trade charts are non-stationary, right? Like they're always going to change over time as we get more years of data put into them. And I also think, like to Jake's point that he mentioned, I think that's definitely something that's under discussed is maybe like the opportunity cost of what you didn't take to take that player. I think the main difference between not taking a trade back option versus evaluating when a team trades up, especially when the team is on the clock that they trade up to, is if the Patriots traded back yesterday to either 6 or 11, there's no guarantee that the draft would have unfolded the same way as it did with the Patriots sticking at 3 and taking Drake May. So you can't necessarily say like, oh, maybe they would have traded back to 11 and they would have been able to get JJ McCarthy at 10 with a slight trade up. You don't know really how the draft would have looked. So I think that's really where the uncertainty really comes into play here.
Yeah, and you have a little bit of the observer effect there, where the very notion of the trade changes basically changes the outcome space, and hence to evaluate that trade in a vacuum, of course, is not necessarily going to yield the perfect understanding of what happened. Okay, speaking of imperfect understanding of what happens, like none of us picked Michael Penix. I, for the Hammer Network, did say that in our mock draft we had one which was what we would do and what we thought would happen. I did put what I would do is take JJ McCarthy at 8. That is what I put in that line. So, you know, there is, like, I'm not the biggest Kirk Cousins fan. I don't know if he's going to come back from this, but it does seem kind of crazy, boys, that we got 4 years, $180 million, and a 2 years effectively guaranteed for Kirk. And now you have Michael Penix, a 24-year-old prospect who's going to be quite old when he finally gets on the field. It is an interesting choice. I know people are going to beat this pick to death for a while until he doesn't start the next year and a half and people forget about it. But like, what was you guys' idea of this pick? And, you know, I think that on one hand, it's getting a lot of flack relative to the Bijan Robinson pick, which it's clearly a better pick than Bijan Robinson last year, but it's also a thematically inconsistent selection with how the Falcons have done business this offseason.
Yeah, I think there's 3 kind of elements here, which I'd love to hear Tej and Ben's thoughts on. But the first element that I identified is the overconfidence per se. We talk a lot about overconfidence in the draft, but you sign a player, and after signing that player, you may be a little overconfident that player will actually be good. So it's interesting that they're obviously adjusting for that uncertainty. Adding into that uncertainty is the injury risk, which I haven't really heard about anyone talk at length about, but we've seen Achilles injuries across time be like pretty detrimental. And it's strange that we're going into a year where two of the major quarterbacks on the major market teams both have Achilles injuries. And really, this is the kind of the basis of, I guess, how we approach Achilles injuries moving on forward. And then finally, which I'll let Tej and Ben talk about, but we've talked so much about how valuable quarterbacks are and how much more valuable they are than position players, at least from how we understand the game now. And they've now spent a lot of investment in that. So what do you guys think about that amount of investment in like a 4 to 6 year plan, I suppose?
Yeah, I mean, I do think you bring up a lot of good points there, where for the Falcons to kind of justify this and make it work, I think they look at their division and they see that their offense, because of the investment that's been added into it, and the strength of the other teams in the division, like the only thing that could probably derail them from winning the division next year is Kirk Cousins getting injured again. From their perspective, I think that's kind of what they're thinking. So maybe they think Michael Penix will come in and play 4 or 5 games, to help them get that home playoff game. I would have rather done it where you're taking someone on day 2 today. You're taking, a Spencer Rattler or Michael Pratt, like someone who can supplement that, or you even sign Jacoby Brissett. You overpay for someone like that on the market, like just to make sure you have that backup quarterback. I think there are other avenues to do that, but that's why it was a little strange to me for that to be the pick. But I think when you look at Penix in particular, you talk about the overconfidence that we have on quarterbacks and how we really have a tough time projecting them college to pro. So maybe they're kind of buying that dip where the public was lower on Penix relative to where he ended up going in the draft. It seemed like others in the league were higher on him than consensus big boards had him. So maybe there's that argument for why he's getting taken ahead of McCarthy. But I really do think it comes down to age, because even if Kirk Cousins plays 15 of the 17 games for the next 2 years, and then Michael Penix takes over after that, you're talking about someone who could be 27 years old by the time they become full-time starter in the NFL. And that's what makes it really interesting to me is can you get both the age advantage and the rookie contract quarterback advantage from this pick? And I think the window of getting both of those is pretty narrow.
Yeah, for sure. I think that's really well said. And the advantage of a rookie quarterback contract is when it comes to a guy like Penix, who's going to be quarterback 4, he doesn't have to be quarterback 1 for the rookie contract to have value if he plays all 4 years and is a surplus there. But now you're cutting into at least 1 year of the surplus. Kirk is tradable after this year, but a team would have to belly up and go for it. And the Falcons would really have to be willing to eat some dead money in that event. Speaking of money that is not dead, our sponsor at Underdog, okay, Underdog Fantasy, with the promo code SUMER, you're going to take up to $100. And when you deposit it, you are going to get $100 back. Our very generous sponsors here at Underdog. For my money, the best fantasy football website there is, the best fantasy football platform to play on, very sleek, and they have multiple different ways for you to go ahead and win. They have best ball, they have they have pick'em, everything like that. Underdog Fantasy, really thrilled to have them as a sponsor for us here at Sumer Sports. Okay, let's talk now about the Minnesota Vikings, Ben, because your Minnesota Vikings, I thought Kwesi held his water, sat there until 10, finally got the trade up, right? And he goes ahead and takes J.J. McCarthy at 10, perfectly fine. I don't think he gave up much in there. But then the Dallas Turner trade, right? Our old friends at PFF said that's about worth 0.4 wins above replacement to move up to do that. 0.4 wins above replacement is about what the top end edge players produce in a year, right? And so that's a really high bar for Dallas Turner to eclipse, especially considering the Vikings just signed Jonathan Grenard and Andrew Van Ginkel to play edge. So this is back to this question though that we've had in the chat room here. I think that this is the big one. HD Tube has had some good questions here as well. But I think that the copium here, if you're the Vikings with this trade up, is to say Dallas Turner's the 9th best player on the board. We're not actually moving up for pick 17. We're moving up for pick 9. That has been an excuse that I've heard my entire career in the league, and it's never really held water for me. And Ben, can you give me an idea of what you thought of when you thought about the pick and kind of now where the Vikings are, where they're kind of shoving in on this year, not a ton of picks left over in future years?
Yeah, definitely. I think it goes back to a couple things that we've obviously talked about previously, but one of them very much is like, I still think there's like a fundamental disagreement in how the league versus analytics versus other people are going to decrease the value of future picks. And that obviously plays a pretty significant role in how you evaluate this actual trade for the Vikings. But the other side of it is also like we know from historical research, I know people at PFF, Timo, you, Eric, and others have kind of gone through this idea of risers and fallers at the NFL draft level. And I think the fallers aspect of it is very much a situation where league insiders know certain pieces about an information more so than the public, and that guy falls. And that's a consensus falling. So to project that guy as actually being the number 9th overall pick, even though he was actually at the 17th overall selection, like that's a projection on an evaluation that it is vastly overcomplicating what they're actually doing. And I think it's in some ways doubling down on your evaluation of that prospect at the expense of what the market is telling you in that sort of situation. So I do think it is in a lot of ways like a fundamental flaw with how you could approach from a team building standpoint, because I think the market in a lot of ways told the Vikings what Dallas Turner was worth last night, and it was very much the 17th overall selection as opposed to the 9th overall selection. And when you couple in what they gave up from the future pick considerations, it was a lot, and it does place a pretty big emphasis on what Dallas Turner needs to turn into in order to kind of justify that sort of trade-off.
Yeah, for sure. And Timo's research was very much this idea there's no such thing as steals, there's just reaches. And for that reason, and look, the market is small, but basically the whole NFL decided that Dallas Turner was the 17th best player in the draft. That means a lot more than one team deciding Dallas Turner is the 9th best player in this draft, and that carries a little bit more weight. Let's talk about one more trade up before we kind of get, or two more trade ups, and the one that I kind of want to talk about here is the Kansas City Chiefs under Brett Veach, who have won 3 Super Bowls in the last 5 years. They're in one of their nemesis, the Buffalo Bills, traded the 28th pick to them, and the Chiefs basically only gave up 1/6 of a win to move up to do that over the course of 4 years, which is hardly anything. And it's because they did something that a lot of these smart teams have been doing, which is pick swapping. Oftentimes, and when we talk about with the Dallas Turner trade, that was, or the J.J. McCarthy trade as well, that's a one pick for many picks trade, right? Which is oftentimes very hard to do. The Chiefs did a 3-for-3 trade here to move up the 5 spots that they needed to move up, the 4 spots they needed to move up. I think that that's a little bit more palatable for people like us. And B, what is Buffalo doing here? Because they obviously have needs at wide receiver. They obviously have needs across the roster. And they're foregoing the bite at the apple, both at 28, but also at 32 when they traded with Carolina. Now they're at pick 33. They're kind of pushing it back a little bit when in many ways they should be kind of trying to accumulate a lot of young talent here.
It's interesting when I was looking at evaluating these two trades, they were very similar. And like you said, the way that the Chiefs and to a certain point, the Panthers as well approached it, I think at best on these two trades, like if you look at them individually, the Bills got an excess value of like a late 5th in the Chiefs one, and kind of, again, best depending on what trade chart you look at. I think this has been Baldwin's, which is quite flat as compared to the other ones. It's an early 5th. What are the Bills doing? I wonder if they just have a wide receiver who they have higher than Xavier Worthy and higher than Xavier Legette. And they think they can reap some value and just felt that they could get a deal done. It's interesting. Like Eric, I'd love your perspective on this, because you're in the room and you're presented with a deal that is profitable. You know that you have a Ladd McConkey or an AD Mitchell or a Jermaine Burton or someone like that higher, and you don't expect him to be picked. Your intel is telling you that he's probably not going to be picked. Do you press the gas and try to, get the value of like an early third, an early fourth, when you have this deal in hand that you can just accept with a snap, and then you have a little bit more value left over?
I think and ASAC has a good point here. Kwesi is analytically friendly, has been on the losing end of trading up this year and down in 22. Like, I think a lot of my friends in the league, when Kwesi went back from 12 to 32, even though the chart said he won, most of my friends were like, look, he could have taken Detroit to the cleaners and rinsed them out a little bit, and he didn't, right? He kind of settled for a trade that was value. And, I think that is a good question. And if you're the Bills, a similar idea with Kwesi, like, Kwesi's traded with the Lions twice and the Packers in the course of his first 3 years in the NFL. Like, that's against the grain, but if you can accumulate value, of course, that's a good thing. In this case, trading with the team that has beaten you in the playoffs 3 of the last 4 years optically doesn't look good. And then if you come out of it with a wide receiver now, AD Mitchell is a heavy favorite. We're going to go over the betting markets here in a little bit. AD Mitchell's a heavy favorite to be the first wide receiver. At least he was the last time I looked. Taken here. Maybe they just knew. Maybe they knew that they were going to get him at 33. And we're going to talk about this in a second. Or maybe they were always angling for the position of the 33rd pick so that they could trade it coming up here on day 2 in these coming hours here. The betting markets have the Bills at about a even money to trade this pick, which I think is the more plausible idea, is getting out there and saying, look, we're going to get a position. And even though we gave up some value we left some value on the table for pick 28 and pick 32, we're going to take somebody to the cleaners here in 33 and get it all back.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point you bring up, where it's like, and I'd be really curious to kind of hear where you stand on number 32 overall versus number 33 overall, because I can see an argument for both sides. Like, if you take a player, especially wide receiver, at 32 overall, and you have the ability to give them the 5th-year option, you extend them after 3 or 4 years, and you can spread their signing bonus out over an additional year, where you're guaranteeing them less money in each subsequent year after that. But at number 33 overall, like, there's a decent amount of drop off in just total 4-year contract, and the 5th-year option isn't as much of an advantage as it used to be. It's guaranteed now. It's definitely higher than it used to be. So, like, yeah, I'd be really curious to see kind of where you stand from that perspective.
Yeah, for sure. So I actually just did a broad calculation, right? When you look at the 32nd pick, the likelihood that guy gets the 5th-year option, I mean, it was about 40% before 2018, and it really hasn't hit a 5th-year option yet since 2019 and beyond. So, let's put that number at 30, that he's a hit, meaning like he'll actually earn the 5th-year option. Well, that means that, and let's assume pick 32 and 33 are no different than each other player-wise. They're both equally good. Well, in that 70% of time that the player's not worth that, you're losing $3 million essentially in this year's money by trading up to get to 32, because that is the delta during the course of the 4 years on that contract. In addition, not the whole second round first contract is guaranteed as well. It's slight, but it's about $3 million difference. So you have to make up, 2.7 million in expected loss in the 70% that the guy isn't a hit, in the case that he is one, right? And so when you look at like maybe a 20% chance that he's like a moderate hit, which means like maybe 5 million of surplus value in that 4th year, which is really what we're talking about, because for second round picks, you would sign them if they're hits after year 3, and for first rounders, you sign them after year 4 because you have that extra year team control. So in that 4th year, maybe you have 5 million of surplus more, but you're still paying back the 3 million that you paid more for having that first pick, right? 32. So again, that's a modest increase. Where you really get the benefit is if the guy is a monster. If the guy ends up being an actual bona fide star, then that surplus value is about, anywhere from 10 to 20 million bucks. But that only happens about what, Tej, 5 to 10% of the time. And so the expected value there of going up and getting that 32nd pick is unless you believe, and you are correct, that your 32nd pick is much, 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 much better than the 33rd pick, it's probably overstated the value of the 5th year option.
Yeah, and I see this question in here from Richard too. Like we're talking about the differences between Xavier Worthy, Xavier Legette, AD Mitchell, all these people. Eric, I guess we should log this one for Thomas. You know, like not only is there this kind of evaluation, mathematical evaluation, personnel evaluation, but there's also kind of the human element that I'm sure Thomas has gone through, especially given, you know, he traded up for Julio Jones, where what if a team calls you and says, oh yeah, our guy at 32 is not your guy, and then they just take another player. I'd be interested to see what Thomas thinks about that in terms of just like the actual interconnectedness of the NFL business after you've done weeks and weeks and weeks of evaluation. You think you can pick your guy, and then maybe someone moves up. I assume from given my experience being on like the agent side a little bit in basketball, that would never occur. But it really puts in perspective kind of the way the personal, the evaluation, the mathematical, the financial all kind of comes together.
Yeah, for sure. This has been a great conversation. I just think that there's so much, you know, about what teams value. I think the NFL draft is such a great peer into the souls of these teams and what they actually care about. To me, though, what you just said, Sam, is very interesting because these boards are so different from each other that the idea, like Xavier Legette is going to be the Panthers pick at 33, probably would have been the Panthers pick at 27 had they felt they needed to go up. And so I feel like a little bit of a sleight of hand in sort of assuming that the 33rd and the 32nd pick are both like pretty, you know, narrowly defined. You know, it's basically flat. But I think that that's effectively how these teams operate after you integrate over the whole set of teams.
Yeah, for sure. And you know, there's so many players, and I think we're going to see that. We talked earlier today about this wide receiver class and how it's tough to parse out if there's a big difference between these players. And you kind of outlined how you can make that decision based off of financial place. Maybe you make that decision based off of what your coach thinks. There's so many variables, and it's just interesting how the rule set kind of changes some of these things.
Yeah, for sure. Well, this has been a lot of fun. Ben, when you look at, I just want to ask one more question before we get to our guests here, Justin Pugh and then Brad Spielberger. Ben, if you look at the markets right now, I know you've been peering over them. What is the one mispriced market that's available now that the degenerates can go and look at for round 2?
Oh, that is a good question. I'm kind of seeing things like taken down, I would say, relatively dramatically. I think, now they're back up, basically. There was a time earlier today, we had a decent amount of props up on DraftKings and other places. To me, this one has been moving, I would say, pretty dramatically in the opposite direction, but Kool-Aid McKinstry versus Cooper DeJean. Cooper DeJean's now minus 200. I think, you know, personally, obviously based on the projection for where you think Cooper DeJean fits from a secondary standpoint, like Kool-Aid McKinstry is a guy Nick Saban said was just as good as Terrion Arnold yesterday, and in a lot of ways, I think has a bona fide case to be a legitimate shutdown cornerback. So I do think that plus price is pretty intriguing. I also think Tyler Nubin, Minnesota Gophers legend, first safety off the board, decent, you know, minus price there. But I would be pretty shocked if anybody kind of leaps in for that first safety off the board. So maybe going a little bit off the radar here, but I like some things on DraftKings, and I very much am excited for this day 2, round 3 NFL draft we have coming up here in Detroit.
My only one, if I had to like something right now, Edgerrin Cooper plus 140 be first linebacker take. I know that there's been a little bit of steam away from him towards Junior Colson, who's minus 125. But I think Cooper is like what everybody wants in a linebacker at the NFL level. This has been a lot of fun. We actually have, and yesterday we had a few difficulties, and honestly, frankly, Thomas and these 3 guys were so good on the show that I didn't feel like I could interrupt it yesterday with other stuff. But we have some really cool interviews where we go over some assumers' cool ideas with a couple people. One person who's actually a current player right now in Justin Pugh of the New York Giants. And we're also going to talk to Bradley Spielberger an NFL agent, our former colleague at PFF. Matt, let's go ahead and cue the Justin Pugh interview. Thank you three for your time here, and as we move forward here, good luck to everybody in the second and third round tonight in an hour.
Thanks, Eric.
We're blessed today to have Justin Pugh. Justin Pugh is a offensive lineman for the New York Giants, was with the Arizona Cardinals, was a first-round pick in 2013. By the New York Giants. So he's going through a lot, or he's been through what a lot of these folks are going through tonight, sitting there hoping to be picked. Justin, how you doing? And what was that night like for you in 2013?
Eric, thanks for having me on. This has been awesome. You came on my show a few weeks ago, and I'm glad I could repay the favor. And there's no better time to talk about it than tonight, Thursday, NFL draft. These kids' lives are changing for the better. The rest of their